A Gambler's Last Hand: How a Mastermind Without Powers Assembled a Team of Gifted Misfits to Outwit a Psychic Crime Lord in a High-Stakes Casino Tournament. Where reality, illusion, and minds collided, crossing the edge of possibility in a game that tested the limits of strategy, power, and unity. The city pulsed with life beneath a canopy of neon lights and twilight haze, a restless organism that never ceased to hum with the sound of human ambition. Among its inhabitants moved a man named Michael, whose name held weight in the underworld of high-stakes gambling. He was a strategist, a virtuoso of deception and skill, known not just for his charisma, but for his seemingly supernatural intuition at the tables. In truth, he needed no magic, just his wit, nerve, and a reputation built through calculated risks and flawless execution. Michael was no ordinary gambler. To him, games of chance were symphonies of probability, patterns to be manipulated, and outcomes to be rehearsed. He had studied the rhythm of roulette wheels, the breathing of blackjack dealers, and the hesitant eye flicks of poker opponents. But no matter how disciplined or skilled he was, he knew the house always played a game behind the game. That is why he no longer played fairly. He schemed, orchestrated distractions, and rigged machines, always a step ahead of security, always leaving just before suspicion caught up. His latest target was a grand casino tucked in the heart of Europe, a place that gleamed with old-world opulence, gold-veined marble, and velvet-lined walls. It was more than a den of vice. It was a fortress of wealth, pride, and surveillance. Yet Michael felt confident. His plan was airtight. He had spent months preparing, bribing insiders, observing camera patterns, and embedding a custom program into a slot network that would allow him to manipulate the outcome remotely. The day of the con arrived like a well-oiled cue. He moved through the halls in a tailored suit, a smile that disarmed suspicion, and an earpiece that kept him tethered to his custom code. His fingers danced across the game, and fortune poured toward him as if the cosmos bent to his will. He watched the reels spin, then stop just as predicted, payout after payout, until the money began to draw attention. That's when it all crumbled. Without warning, the machines shifted. Their outputs no longer matched his script. It was as if someone else had seized control of an invisible hand, flipping the table on him. Then the alarm sounded. Security closed in faster than he could react, their movements uncannily precise. Michael escaped only through instinct and a deep knowledge of the casino's layout. He fled through maintenance shafts and underground corridors, abandoning the money and his equipment, his carefully built plan collapsing behind him like a house of cards. Something had gone terribly wrong. His plan hadn't just failed, it had been unraveled from within. But by what? A traitor? A software glitch? Or something more? The precision with which he had been countered unnerved him. It felt personal, surgical, almost unnatural. He vanished into the lower folds of the city, where the rich never looked and the desperate scraped by. In the solitude of a worn-down hostel, Michael replayed the failure over and over. Each detail was accounted for. Each risk had been mitigated. No human could have predicted his every move the way they had. That thought festered in his mind until a new question formed. What if it hadn't been a human? Driven by desperation and curiosity, Michael descended into the fringes of society, seeking knowledge about things he once dismissed. He sought out the obscure and the disbelieved people who spoke in whispers about others with powers beyond science, born with gifts or curses that let them control forces others could only imagine. They were called gifted, and to most, they were myths. Yet Michael believed now. Someone had bested him using more than skill. He needed to level the playing field, and for that, he would have to find those with gifts of their own. His search began with hushed conversations in forgotten places, abandoned arcades, pawn shops, and hidden bars. A name surfaced: Eric, a young man known to shift fortune itself. They said dice bent to his will, cards danced in his hands, and no matter how random the world seemed, he always came out on top. Michael tracked him to a seedy underground casino and witnessed it himself. Eric wasn't trying. He simply radiated luck. Machines paid out when he approached, and opponents folded before the game began. There was no sleight of hand. It was pure, unfiltered probability manipulation. Michael approached with caution and intent. Eric resisted at first, suspicious of anyone who came too close. But Michael offered something different. Not admiration, not exploitation, but purpose. He promised Eric a chance to test his gift not for pennies, but against a true adversary, a chance to beat a system that had once beaten Michael. Together, they moved to find the next. A woman named Veronica, who had lived a life of shifting personas. She was said to have a presence so commanding that people believed her words without question. More than charm, it was influenced by a psychic nudge that made others feel, act, and believe what she projected. Michael found her performing small cons in crowded places, testing her influence on unsuspecting strangers. She didn't just lie. She rewrote their beliefs in real time. Veronica joined not for the money, but for the challenge. She had spent her life running from herself, using her gift to escape entanglements and build facades. Michael offered her a new kind of mask, not one for escape, but one for battle. They needed more. Their third recruit was Tony, a showman lost in the illusion of his own brilliance. He had the power to distort perception, crafting illusions that defied the senses. He had spent years as a stage magician before the truth of his gift became too hard to hide. Now he lived in exile, conjuring visions to entertain those who thought they were dreaming. With Michael's proposal came a return to relevance, a way to weaponize his illusions against someone who manipulated the mind in far more terrifying ways. Finally, they found Kevin, a quiet young man who had been raised away from society by fearful guardians. He rarely spoke, but his eyes revealed an intensity few could meet. Kevin moved things without touching them. Coins hovered, doors opened, and glasses slid across the table with no sound. He controlled the world around him with silent force. He was afraid of himself, of what he could do if he lost control. But with Michael's guidance, he saw structure, order, and trust. Together, they became more than individuals with powers. They became a unit, a carefully balanced team built for infiltration, misdirection, and control. Michael spent weeks training them to synchronize their skills. He did not wield powers, but he understood people, and he understood games. He choreographed their actions like a heist, each step rehearsed, each outcome considered. Their goal was clear. Gordon, the man behind the mysterious force that had upended Michael's last job. A legend in the gambling world, Gordon ran the world's most exclusive underground tournament. He was no ordinary psychic. He was a telepath of such power that he could peer into a man's soul and alter his will without detection. He didn't just win games, he dictated their outcomes before cards were dealt. The tournament he ran was protected by layers of secrecy, guarded by both muscle and mind. To face him was not to play cards. It was to engage in psychological warfare with a master of thought. Michael used every connection and ounce of cunning to secure an invitation. With identities forged and backstories constructed, the team infiltrated the event. The casino that hosted it was unlike any other. It was an architectural marvel, luxury fused with mystery. High ceilings stretched over rooms lit with chandeliers that glowed like stars. Surveillance was omnipresent, but it was more than cameras. It was a feeling of being watched, not by technology, but by something alive. The tournament began with a grand spectacle. Wealthy elites, criminal magnates, and world-renowned gamblers filled the velvet-lined halls. The chips on the table represented fortunes, but for Michael and his team, the stakes were much greater. Each round they survived brought them closer to Gordon. Each play tested their unity, their powers, and their resolve. Eric manipulated the odds with grace, ensuring favorable outcomes when tension was high. Veronica swayed the perceptions of dealers and players alike, subtly guiding their actions. Tony crafted illusions to distract, mislead, and confuse. Kevin ensured objects moved in their favor without anyone noticing. Michael, the orchestrator, kept the tempo, watching Gordon from across the room, measuring his reactions. At first, Gordon watched with amusement. He sensed the disturbance, but not its origin. The games continued. Michael's team advanced, chips piled up, opponents folded in confusion or defeat. But Gordon's expression began to change. He could feel the psychic pressure in the room, tendrils of power not his own. He began probing, pushing into thoughts, unraveling masks. As the final rounds loomed, Gordon's presence became more direct. He sat at the tables now, an immovable force. His eyes lingered longer, his gaze dissected intention from bluff. The team began to feel the pressure of a mind that could split them apart. Michael realized then that their greatest weapon was not their powers, but their cohesion. They had to act not as individuals, but as a singular force. Their next moves would define not only the outcome of the tournament, but their very survival. The final stretch of the tournament unfolded with a quiet intensity, like a storm building behind a clear sky. The players at the table had narrowed to a few, but beneath the surface, the true confrontation brewed. Gordon sat at the center of it all, calm and unreadable, his fingers lazily brushing over a stack of chips, while his eyes studied more than faces. He studied thoughts, intentions, and fears. He was no longer just a competitor, but a predator within his domain, fully aware that something foreign had entered his web. Michael and his team had come far, moving in calculated harmony, but the deeper they penetrated into Gordon's circle, the more strained their connection became. It wasn't suspicion or betrayal, it was psychic intrusion. Gordon was no longer observing them, he was entering their minds. The first to falter was Tony. His illusions had been a reliable cover, casting false shadows and bending perspectives to shield the team's actions. But Gordon began to interfere. The images Tony crafted distorted unpredictably, melting into twisted versions of themselves. Tony's sense of reality wavered. He struggled to focus, his mind no longer anchored to the here and now. Michael saw it, recognized it for what it was, and Gordon wasn't just reacting. He was attacking. Veronica attempted to redirect Gordon's focus with her influence. She reached into the minds of those watching, planting unease and misdirection. But Gordon's psychic presence was far stronger. Her powers, which once manipulated thoughts with ease, now met resistance like stone. The mental fog she cast began to backfire, turning on herself. She could feel the pushback, a cold mental force severing her connection with others and whispering doubts into her own mind. Kevin, always quiet and internal, felt it next. His telekinetic reach faltered as Gordon's presence entered his awareness. Small objects he had subtly controlled now twitched unpredictably. A coin he moved slid off course. A chip stack he tried to shift crumbled awkwardly, drawing eyes. Michael quickly adjusted, covering for the mistake, but Kevin's hands trembled. It was no longer about physical control. Gordon was pressing into their confidence, planting seeds of chaos. Only Eric's luck seemed to hold. The natural field of probability that surrounded him acted as a passive shield, deflecting Gordon's mental prods. Cards continued to land in his favor, wheels spun to his needs, but even he began to sense the distortion. Gordon's mind couldn't fully control fortune, but he could interfere with perception. Eric began to question if his streak was truly his own anymore. Michael remained the anchor. He had no powers to manipulate reality or thought, but he could see the crumbling edges of his team's composure. He adjusted their strategy, minimizing risk and reinforcing structure. He knew they had one chance left to destabilize Gordon before the final hand. The plan had always included a grand illusion, one massive, layered fabrication that would overwhelm Gordon's senses just long enough for Michael to expose him. But Tony was too weakened now, and their powers too compromised. They would have to adapt. Michael refocused them, not with commands, but with silent trust. He tapped their shared rhythm, the bond formed through preparation, through belief. As the final game approached, the casino was silent, save for the murmurs of spectators and the soft hum of lights. Gordon, relaxed and ominous, sat with hands clasped, his mind reaching outward like tendrils of invisible mist. He felt everything. He felt Michael's heartbeat, Tony's anxiety, Veronica's doubt, Kevin's strain, and Eric's guarded optimism. He believed he had won before the cards had even been dealt. But Michael had one more layer to play. They began by triggering small tricks, minor illusions, and subtle acts of persuasion, not to fool Gordon, but to distract the observers and flood the space with unpredictability. Veronica whispered fear into the minds of bystanders, sending ripples of discomfort through the room. Tony projected conflicting visions into the eyes of peripheral players and dealers. Kevin caused cards to flicker subtly off course, and Eric used his improbable luck to create a series of impossible wins. The goal was not to beat Gordon in cards. It was to overload the space with psychic static to fill the mental environment with noise. Michael relied on Gordon's pride. He knew Gordon would want to control everything, and by forcing him to extend his awareness over a growing storm of falsehoods, Michael hoped to thin his concentration and expose him. Gordon responded as expected. He pushed back harder. His telepathy reached to silence the storm, his mind sweeping across the illusions, peeling them back, correcting falsehoods. But in doing so, he stretched his awareness to its breaking point. That's when Michael executed the final phase. It wasn't a trick or a gamble. It was raw psychological warfare. He projected nothing, but his thoughts became erratic, contradictory, and fragmented. His mind became a maze of symbols and half-memories. Gordon, used to clarity, was forced into confusion. The signals he picked up from Michael's mind were layered traps of self-doubt, trauma, and mirrored thoughts that led nowhere. It wasn't a mental battle anymore. It was a psychic misdirection on a personal scale. Gordon hesitated. His concentration faltered. And at that moment, Kevin summoned his last ounce of strength. His power surged and tilted the dealer's hand just slightly. The cards were dealt. Eric's improbable win unfolded in real time. Chips slid toward their side. Gordon watched in disbelief. He tried to undo it with a thought, but the illusions returned, Tony's flickering distortions magnified by the pressure in the room. Veronica clouded the minds of the few guards who reacted. Time itself seemed to bend in that final second, everything moving just slow enough for the moment to crystallize. Michael stood, chips in hand, and walked away from the table. Gordon reached out, not with words but with mental force, one last attempt to pull him back. But the moment had passed. The psychic feedback he endured from having his mind looped, his reality bent, and his certainty shattered had left him vulnerable. His grip failed. Security rushed in, confused by what they had witnessed. To them, there had been no magic, no illusions, only confusion, a high-stakes loss, and an abrupt exit by unknown players. By the time clarity returned, Michael and his team had disappeared. Outside, the night had shifted. The team regrouped in silence, breathless and changed. They had won, but not through domination. They had survived something few could imagine. Gordon had been defeated not through strength of power, but by unity, unpredictability, and courage. They had faced a man who thought himself a god, and they had reminded him of his limits. But the victory came with a cost. Tony, whose illusions had pushed the edge of sanity, would need time to recover. The images he had created still lingered in his vision. He saw things that weren't there and felt textures that didn't exist. Kevin's mind burned with fatigue. He had used power he never thought he'd dare unleash. Veronica's influence had touched too many minds in too short a time, and she felt the residue thoughts she could not unhear. Even Eric, untouched physically, carried a new wariness, unsure where his luck ended and Gordon's shadow began. Michael bore no supernatural scars, but the burden he carried was deeper. He had led them into a battle not only against an enemy, but against themselves. Each had been tested beyond their boundaries. Their powers had once been tools for survival. Now they had become weapons in a greater game. And Michael knew that such games never truly ended. They dispersed quietly in the days that followed. No celebration, no farewell, just the understanding that they had shared something no one else ever would. Their paths diverged not in anger, but in necessity. Each needed to heal in their own way. Michael walked alone through the city once more, this time with no target, no plan. He had played the game beyond the edge of understanding and came back whole. Yet part of him remained entangled in the echo of that final hand, in the psychic tremor of Gordon's fall. He knew Gordon was still alive, somewhere in the shadows, nursing his defeat. And he knew men like that never disappeared. They waited. In quiet places, whispers began again. Of a gambler who bent chance itself. Of a woman who could rewrite reality with a look. Of a ghost who conjured worlds and vanished into dreams. Of a boy who moved the world with a thought. And of the strategist who united them, not with power, but with vision. They had crossed beyond the edge of probability and returned. The world had not noticed. But in hidden corners, those who dealt in the impossible began to prepare. Because somewhere in the future, the game would begin again, and next time, the edge would be sharper, the minds stronger, and the cost far greater.